Let's get started on strong women. So straight off the bat, let's recognize that the most prevalent example of the strong woman trope that exists in the culture, shall we say, is the strong Black women. So we have celebrities that are held up as examples of this trope, like, for example, Beyonce, we say things like Black Queen, etc., etc., etc. The associations of Black women with strength is by no means a new association, nor will it be an unfamiliar one for the vast majority of you. But the roots of this discourse are actually pretty horrific. So where does this association come from? What's its origin story? Well, historically, representations in white Western culture of Black women as uniquely strong coincide with the history of slavery. So something we often don't recognize is that the ideology of racism, particularly of racism as understood in biological terms, so the notion that Black bodies were fundamentally different from white bodies in a biological sense, emerges as a direct result of slavery. And the tenets of this belief system were thus directly shaped by the economic requirements of the system of enslavement. So let's unpack that a bit, because that's a lot to unpack. So I'm not saying that the tendency to recognize physical difference didn't exist before slavery. I'd even argue that the propensity for humans to create in-groups and out-groups is pretty innate, right? But rather that the hierarchical ordering of these in-groups and out-groups according to race was something that emerged as a direct result of the enslavement of African peoples. So we know this because the first interactions between white Europeans and Black Africans didn't actually occur in the context of racialized hierarchies. So Black Africans can be found living in Europe some 150 years before slavery really kicks off, and not as slaves, but as free and even elite individuals. In England, some were members of the church, some intermarried with white Europeans. There was even one African man who worked as a trumpeter for the court of King Henry VIII, not as a slave, but as a free man who was a member of the king's fucking court, right? So in a way, the assumption that human beings are innately racist or innately prone to organize according to racial difference is itself a product of slavery. Basically, an ideology of racial hierarchies emerges at the same time that chattel slavery really starts to kick off around the 1660s, 1670s. And that's because the emergence of this ideology is in direct response to the needs of the slave trade. So most obviously, the first incentive to establish this kind of race-based thinking is that, the belief in racial inferiority of Black peoples provided a justification for their enslavement, right? The second motivation is a bit less obvious, but perhaps more insidious. And it's that the system of racism was essential in protecting the property rights of slaveholders, because racism ensured that lower class whites identified with the white ruling class and not with the Black enslaved class. The way that this system was first put into practice was through legal systems called slave codes, which started emerging towards the end of the 1600s across the Caribbean and the Americas. Slave codes were essentially sets of laws that dictated relationships between the white free population and the Black enslaved population, and effectively served to make racism a legal requirement and ban racial intermixing. So the creation of these codes was necessary to maintain the nascent system of slavery itself, because in the early years of the colonies, there had been much more intermixing between lower class whites and the Black enslaved population, even with cases of white women marrying Black enslaved laborers. And this kind of thing, posed a real threat to slaveholders because, it integrated their enslaved laborers within white society and weakened their property rights. Essentially, it was a lot easier to claim that another human being was your property and not a human being if they weren't legally tied to someone who was not considered property. Put differently, racial intermixing undermined the system of slavery because if enslaved people were allowed to build community with the free population, non-slaveholding whites might not take so kindly to their enslavement. And these slave codes became the ideological backbone of much of the racism that followed in the 18th, 19th, and even 20th century because they legally constructed Black peoples as subhuman. So taking it back to the whole strong women trope, right? How does this all slot in? Well, we've already discussed how racism was molded around the economic requirements of slavery, and the association of Black bodies in general as uniquely strong was a part of this. So both Black men and Black women were constructed as stronger than the average white person, allegedly having a greater physical strength and endurance that was often likened to apes. This was particularly common from the 1850s onwards, when the publication of Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species led to a spike in the use of language stemming from evolutionary biology within racist discourse. So this is the claim that Black people are essentially like less evolved white people, closer on the evolutionary chain to primates. Now, to be clear, Charles Darwin did not subscribe to these views, and he was vocally opposed to slavery, but that didn't stop his theories being manipulated in this way by racists, including by his own half-cousin, Sir Francis Galton, who is most famous for originating the theory of eugenics, which was essentially the belief that you could apply the principles of Mendelian hereditary theory to human beings, i.e. that you could try to breed out negative traits in the population by suppressing the birth rate of so-called bad stock and promoting the birth rate of more desirable individuals. Charming guy, right? But anyway, more on him another time, actually. So we can already see how the system of slavery has a lot of paradoxes and contradictions. Because in one way, we would think that the association of Black bodies with strength would make them physically superior to white bodies. But this was all being logicked out by big brain whites of the time, who instead argued that this alleged strength was proof of the intellectual and spiritual inferiority of Black people. It's literally portrayed as this brute-like animalistic strength. Now, again, the association of Black bodies with strength serves the system of slavery well because it justifies the brutal physical labor enslaved bodies were put through. So this is ultimately why the trope is applied to both Black men and Black women equally, even though this goes against the received wisdom at the time in terms of gender roles, which would have stated that female bodies, and by this we're probably talking more properly about white female bodies, were weak, fragile, vulnerable, delicate, something to be protected. Because the system of slavery required the erasure of a protected feminine status from the bodies of Black women, so it was erased. And this is why we have that very famous speech that has been attributed to Black abolitionist Sojourner Truth, which has now come to be known as the Ain't I a Woman speech, also the title of a seminal book by Black feminist scholar Bell Hooks in the 1980s, which we'll get back to later, where she essentially highlights that racism strips Black women of the normal protections of womanhood. And this speech was allegedly delivered to the Women's Convention in Akron, Ohio in 1851. And here I'm quoting the Ain't I a Woman speech. That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Now, I'm saying this speech has been attributed to Sojourner Truth and was allegedly delivered in 1851 because there is some dispute amongst historians about the veracity of these claims, right? So an original transcription of the speech was published in a couple of local newspapers in 1851, but these transcriptions did not include the phrase "ain't I a woman." The version that is famous today that does include this phrase was actually published some 12 years later during the American Civil War in 1863 by a white woman called Frances Dana Barker Gage. Now, Gage was a feminist and abolitionist, and historians have theorized that she essentially rewrote Truth's speech to appeal more strongly to a white unionist audience, adding in a number of colloquialisms that would make Truth sound more like a Black woman enslaved in the American South than she would have actually done in real life, given that Truth was born and raised in New York and only spoke Dutch until she was 9 years old. And I think it's really revealing, that even as this white woman who rewrote Truth's speech is trying to promote like this abolitionist goal to like end slavery, she is incapable of doing so without restating the racial stereotypes that underpin the very system that she's seeking to dismantle. She is incapable of not including the kind of dehumanizing allusions to the physical strength of Black women in her rewrite, even as she's trying to persuade her audience of Truth's humanity. Gage is forcing Truth to say, I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it and bear the lash as well.